Some people are quite surprised to discover how much the Catholic Church has to say about nature and climate. But they really shouldn't be. The Catholic faith is concerned with the whole of human life in this world and in the next. And nature and climate are at the absolute core of our Christian responsibility. Catholic social teaching in the past 50 years has emphasised this very consistently, that as Christians we're called to exercise responsibility towards creation, responsibility towards nature, responsibility increasingly in the last decades towards climate as an actually core part of our Christian faith, not as a peripheral concern, not as a luxury, not as an extra optional ideal level of commitment for some people who are into that. This is actually the universal obligation of faith. When Pope Francis, who has become known as a very significant, influential environmental leader, who has exerted a lot of influence at the global level in that cause, when he promulgated his epoch-making teaching document, Laudato Si', there were people in some contexts who actually criticised him for teaching on this topic. They said this is actually outside of the concern of a pope. This is not to do with religion. This is to do with politics or to do with economics or to do with science, and that the pope should really stay out of that sphere altogether. They should really think again. Anyone who feels that or thinks that should really think again. The Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is based on an understanding of what this world actually is. Namely, that this world is creation. It's not just an inert object, it's not just furniture, it's actually loved, it's willed, it's called to communion in God. We are journeying to God alongside all the creatures of this world, and that a core part of the human vocation as such, not even the Christian vocation, but the human vocation, is to till and keep, as it says in Genesis. That basically means to care for, to make fruitful, to make productive, to fulfill the capacities of the earth, not to destroy it. This understanding of the human vocation is basic. We are creatures placed in the world with that responsibility. And the key concept in Pope Francis's environmental teaching is ecological conversion. Ecological conversion expresses the idea, the understanding, that taking care of the environment, taking care of nature, responding to the destruction of nature and the damage to our climate and so on is, and this is his language, is a core part of our faithfulness to Jesus Christ. That if we don't do that, we are being unfaithful to Jesus Christ. We have an incomplete conversion. And in that context, what we're doing to the earth is, and he says this very, very frankly, is a sin. It's a falling away from that faithfulness. It's an unacceptable betrayal of what that world is, which is that it's a gift. It's given by God. In the context of what's happening at the moment, the Church's teaching has been extremely clear. Climate change is real. It's dangerous. More than dangerous, it's lethal. It's human-caused. And each one of us has a responsibility before God to do what we can to prevent it getting worse, to resist the forces that are somehow maintaining the status quo. The Church asks all people of goodwill, Christians, people of faith, to act with all of their energy, care, concern, commitment, passion, to resist the apathy, to resist the denial, to resist the despair, to have imagination and creativity, to exert every kind of influence that they have, to prevent climate change getting worse, to prevent the destruction of nature getting worse, to be part of the healing of creation. The Church's teaching is just not ambiguous. It's absolutely front and centre in the calling and responsibility of every Christian in the world. It's also a truth of theology and a truth of science that everything is connected. This is the basic insight of ecology as a science. It's also the basic insight of an understanding of God's creation as an ordered, harmonious whole in which creatures exist only in the context of relationships. If you disturb any of those relationships, you end up with effects all over creation. This is why Pope Francis goes on and on about everything being connected. For the Church, the most significant impact of that, of course, is on the poorest. The Church has always had a special concern for the poor. Climate change impacts the poor disproportionately. So when we fail to care for creation, or when we fail to take the threats to climate and nature seriously, when we fail to do what is in our power to prevent damage to climate and nature, the people that we're letting down are the poorest. They're the very people that God asks us to place front and centre, that God asks us to put first. These, of course, are the people, when we're talking about the poor, these are the people who have actually done the least to contribute to the crisis in climate and nature. And yet they're the ones who suffer most. And that's a core obligation of our faith, is to care for the poor. So the issues of climate and nature are not separate from all of the other moral concerns that we're familiar with from our faith. That too is part of that conversion, is recognising that when we emit fossil fuels as a civilization or as individuals, the people who bear the brunt of that down the line are both future generations who didn't contribute to this problem and the poor who also didn't contribute to this problem to anything like the same degree as people in developed countries. So that element of justice is also a central part of the Church's teaching about climate and nature. Laudato Si appeared in 2015 on the eve of the Paris Climate Summit, which was the key moment in international efforts to combat climate change. That was where the international community agreed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. In the years that have elapsed since then, efforts to slow global warming have faltered, they have regressed, and at the same time, climate change is accelerating. We were told, scientists predicted, that we wouldn't reach that threshold of 1.5 degrees of warming for most of the century, for 90 years. But we're already nearly there. We are nearly at 1.5 degrees of warming. That may not sound like a lot, but it's a catastrophe. The reason why it's so important to understand and absorb and act on the Church's teaching on climate and nature is because we really are running out of time. Pope Francis took the unprecedented step of releasing essentially a follow-up document to Laudato Si a few months ago called Laudate Deum, in which he points out that since he wrote Laudato Si, things have not got better. The situation has got more difficult and more critical over the last decade. The Church started teaching about this very explicitly at Vatican II. That's a long time ago, that's decades ago. And the teaching has got louder and louder and louder as the crisis has deepened. And we're now in a stage where much of the damage is irreversible. But any further delays cause further damage. There is no downside to acting now. There's no such thing as too late. Because the longer we wait to fix this, to address this, the more people will die, the more people will suffer, the more damaged the earth will be. This teaching is relevant now in the sense that our future as a human race depends on us taking action to prevent further warming, to prevent further destruction of nature. Pope Paul VI, who did teach on the environment in the 60s and 70s, described the Church as an expert in humanity. He said that was the Church's vocation in the world, was to be an expert in humanity. If the Church is supposed to be the moral leader, the moral representative of humanity itself, there can be nothing more important for the Church to teach on, nothing more important for Catholics, for Christians to stand up for. The first thing we can all do as Catholics or as Christians is accept before God and before one another our responsibility for this situation. That's what Pope Francis means by ecological conversion, first of all, is an inner understanding. This is my problem. This is our problem. I take responsibility for doing what I can, whatever that might be. It's always, of course, very limited, but I take responsibility, my community takes responsibility, my church takes responsibility, my country, my region, my nation, for doing what we can. Practically, what does that mean? We know that we can all act as individuals. We know that we can take various steps to reduce our environmental impact, whether that be by taking fewer planes or by eating fewer animal products, these kinds of things that we're all quite familiar with. Some of us have substantial financial resources, whether that be personally or as part of communities, work, church, other kinds of groups. We should immediately divest from fossil fuels if we haven't done that already. We shouldn't be letting fossil fuel states and companies use our money to destroy the future. These are all incredibly important actions. However, probably at this point, the most important thing we can all do is exercise political influence. The reason for that is that we've now got to the stage where only coordinated, regional, national, global efforts will prevent further catastrophe. If we are lucky enough to live in a democracy, we should be standing up and saying that. We should be saying it to our candidates. We should be saying it to those who represent us in government, whether we voted for them or not. We should be saying it to our fellow voters. We should be starting conversations at every opportunity. We should be starting conversations with people we know, perhaps even with people we don't know, in whatever contexts we live and work and pray and have recreation. All the different relationships that we're in, we can use those relationships to start conversations. There's no individual way of solving this problem. We have to create change at the system level. We have to create legislation. We have to create regulation. We have to invest in renewable technologies. But let's not indulge the idea that our faith is private, that the obligations of our faith only concern me and my private life. That's not true. We're supposed to be saving the world. That's what it's all about. We're supposed to be participating in God's project to save the world. And that has, of course, an ultimate and transcendent dimension, which is the gathering up of everything in Christ. But that comes directly into the present. That comes into the present as moral responsibility to act. And in our time, in our moment, that means trying to prevent further rise in global temperatures, trying to prevent further destruction of nature by every means necessary. Most of all in this time, by political means, by exerting our legitimate political influence.